Welcome back, Nerd Squad. It's me, Amanda McKnight, aka Vampex13, and today we are exploring what happens when Spider-Man stops holding back. The answer was given to us in a storyline that spans multiple comics and months. It was epic, it was brutal, and if you've wondered what happens when Peter is forced to go to a much darker place, you're about to live that reality along with me. We saw hints of it in No Way Home when Peter was forced to deal with the loss of his Aunt May. But he managed to be reeled back in by his alternate self. But here, he doesn't have older, more mature Peters to do that for him. And as such, he pretty much goes off the deep end. The inciting incident for why Peter goes off the deep end is covered in the first part of the story, and the rest is simply about what happens as a result, with Peter even returning to his black costume in the end. Not the symbiote one, just borrowing the look of that costume to reflect the fact that all color and witty quips has left him, and his approach to crime fighting. Peter, MJ, and Aunt May are all outside reminiscing about Uncle Ben when suddenly Aunt May is shot. MJ calls 911 and Peter frantically looks around to see if he can spot a shooter, but realizing that the clock is ticking and there isn't even enough time for them to wait for an ambulance for May, Peter, without his costume on, swings his way through the city and delivers her to the hospital. Meanwhile, in prison, the Kingpin receives a cryptic message from a police officer and shares his favorite quote that Euripides from the play Medea speaks: "Whom the gods would destroy, they first drive mad." Peter sets out to find out who has done this to Aunt May, mainly blaming himself though, as Peter usually does. However, here he maybe has a little bit of a reason to do that. This is because this storyline takes place after the events of the First Civil War. Now, during the First Civil War, Peter was convinced by Tony Stark's Iron Man, whom he was aligned with at the start of that event, publicly unmasked to promote the Superhero Registration Act. Peter does this, but later decides that Tony is actually in the wrong and allies himself instead with Captain America, which means since his identity as Spider-Man is public, that he and his family are constantly on the run, hopping from motel to motel. If he had never unmasked, he figures, Aunt May would have never been targeted. Probably true. Before he leaves MJ and Aunt May, he urges MJ to check Aunt May in under her maiden name, Riley, in order to protect her from further attacks. Peter returns to investigate and finds a police officer at the shooter's perch with a sniper rifle and scope nearby. He webs up the officer and basically leaves him there, just taking the scope with him, on the trail of who supplied the weapon. He finds an illegal weapon sale going on and he breaks it up, still in his civilian clothing. When Peter interrogates one of the men involved and he hesitates to give Peter the answer Peter's looking for, Peter breaks his hand. Back at the hospital, MJ visits Aunt May, whose status is critical. The doctors tell MJ that May is in a coma and that due to her old age, she is struggling to heal even with the help of the machines they have her hooked up to. As a result, they are almost certain that she won't make it. Peter swings his way up to the top of a tall building to retrieve something. This item is all webbed up, but he undoes the webbing to reveal his cloth black suit that Black Cat made for him, which he initially stopped wearing because he felt it sent the wrong message. He once again dons this suit, as I said earlier, and vows not to rest until he kills the person who's responsible for the attack on Aunt May, and finally get his revenge. In his hunt to track down Aunt May's shooter, he learns that Jake Martino was the one who purchased the specific scope he found at the scene of the crime. He discovers this after throwing one of the arms dealers that he's questioning out of a window, catching him at the last second with a thread of webbing, prompting the man to reveal the buyer as Jake. Initially, this guy didn't want to answer his questions, but throw someone out a window, all of a sudden they're changing their tune. Peter then tracks Jake down and beats him brutally, even breaking his arm. Right when Jake is about to name who hired him, however, he is shot in the chest. The person who shot Jake gets away, but Peter manages to at least hit him with a spider tracer. An ambulance arrives to take Jake to the hospital and Spider-Man goes along with him. But unfortunately, Jake dies before he can answer the question he was about to answer before he was tragically shot in the chest. Once at the hospital, Peter runs into MJ, who passes on the tragic news that the doctors gave her. May is not going to make it. Heading back out, Spider-Man tracks down the shooter who got away just as he's on the phone with someone. Peter webs up his mouth and listens to who is on the other end, hearing the voice of Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin. Fisk then asks Peter what he can do for him, and Peter responds that, well, Fisk can die. After learning who was on the phone, Peter questions the shooter, who we learn is named Jim. He finds out that Jake was actually hired to shoot Peter, not May. Spider-Man then asks why Jim shot Jake, and the man simply says that he knew something that Wilson Fisk didn't, but as to what, he doesn't know. That's all he knows. Meanwhile, back in prison, Fisk is approached by the same police officer as before. This time, Fisk has a favor to ask of him. The police officer says he'll do whatever Fisk asks as long as it doesn't break the rules. Wilson Fisk responds by saying what he is asking is beyond the rules. then smashes to pieces the desk he has in the cell and reveals that it is filled with millions of dollars in cash. He tells the officer to divide the money amongst the officers in the prison. The officer frees Fisk, and Wilson asks him to bring Fisk his usual attire. Peter takes Jim down to the sewers and ties him up, leaving him to the mercy of the rats. As Peter talks about the food chain threatening Jim, Jim becomes scared and pleads with Spider-Man, saying he'll do anything he wants. Spider-Man sees that Jim was really just another victim of Kingpin and decides not to kill him, but does tell Jim to spread the word amongst his friends to leave him and his family alone or else. Then he leaves, heading back to the hospital to pay May another visit. Hoping that his healing factor will help her, he gives her some of his own blood via a transfusion. Finally knowing who is behind the hit, he heads to the prison in his black suit to finally confront the Kingpin. Upon breaking into the prison, Peter finds Wilson surrounded by other inmates. He and Fisk fight, and Kingpin taunts him for believing in the greater good. This pushes Spider-Man to a breaking point, and he beats Fisk to within an inch of his life. He says that while Spider-Man will not kill him, Peter will. Unmasking, Peter taunts and torments Fisk, saying how easy it would be with his super strength to crush Fisk, and even threatening to suffocate Fisk by shooting his webbing up Fisk's nostrils. Eventually, Kingpin shouts at Peter that if he really is going to kill him, then he should just do it now and be done with it. However, Peter responds that he won't kill him. At least not yet. He says he has done one better by defeating him and proving in front of all the other inmates at the prison how weak Wilson Fisk is. He warns everyone in the prison that if any of them ever come for him or his family, they will end up like Fisk. And he also says that Kingpin's life is now tied to May's. If she dies, then Peter will return and finish the job. Peter then leaves the prison. A defeated Kingpin and all the inmates slowly and solemnly return to their cells. Following the confrontation, Peter and MJ are forced to confront the fact that while the hospital Peter brought her to is the best, they can't really afford to keep May there. They've been paying exclusively in cash, and it's only a matter of time before someone becomes suspicious. However, Peter is distraught at the thought of moving May, so MJ agrees that they can wait a little bit longer. Peter stays up all night talking to Aunt May, hoping she'll wake up and respond, but she never does. When he steals one of her blood work reports, he learns that his blood transfusion has basically made no difference. May isn't getting better. At this point, the police show up to ask some questions. Peter senses they are in trouble with his spider sense tingling, and he is able to hide, turn off the lights, and incapacitate the officer so he, MJ, and May can escape. They illegally transport May to a new, more affordable hospital in order to protect all of their identities. This really was one of Peter's darkest eras, to be honest. Even by the end of this story, we're left with a pretty bleak resolution. May is still in the hospital, she's still on her deathbed, no longer even getting the best care possible, and Peter and MJ are both still on the run, as Peter is still technically a fugitive, being hunted down by S.H.I.E.L.D. for being anti-registration. At the end of the story, Peter reflects on just how low he has fallen, acknowledging that he has committed at least 9 felonies during these events. And what's worse, his fingerprints are basically everywhere, so he could very well be arrested and convicted for these crimes. In case you also wanted to give this story a read as it was written, you can check it. In case you also wanted to give this story a read as it was written, you can check it out in the J. Michael Straczynski and Ron Garney run of The Amazing Spider-Man from issues 539 to 543, or you can just grab a trade paperback collection of the story, which is titled Back in Black, from your local library or your local comic shop. I definitely recommend giving it a read if you enjoyed our summary here. Although maybe just read it by itself, as following this Spider-Man storyline came the dreaded One More Day, which of course this pretty much directly leads into. Although at least makes a lot more sense why, Peter had to make that deal. Well, Peter and MJ had to make that deal with Mephisto. And until next time, you stay nerdy.